Hey guys, today we're going to be doing the notes on Jackson's political rise. This is 404. We're going to be looking at the breakdown of the Democratic Republicans into brand new political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. So let's get started. So by 1824, this is going to be close to the end of the Monroe administration and the era of good feelings. Factions, which is just a fancy word for subgroups, start to develop within the Democratic Republican Party, right? You had that one party system during the era of good feelings, which is why there were good feelings because there was no fighting. Well, now the fighting's going to start again. So we have two major groups in the Democratic Republicans. The first one is going to be led by John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. They are proponents of a strong federal government. They like the American system that our boy Henry Clay came up with. They like manufacturing as kind of like the base of the country. So they're going to be one group. And on the other side, there's more of a Jackson crowd. So these people are more like states' rights, weaker federal government. They don't like tariffs. They're typically from more like southern and western states that rely more on agriculture. And they're also, a lot of them are just kind of like less wealthy. They're kind of the common people of the country. So these are our two kind of major subgroups in the Democratic Republicans. So there's an election in 1824, and even though you can see here it says no parties, it's because everyone is part of one party essentially, but you have these different people running who have different ideas. We know that the electoral vote is what really matters, and no one actually gets a majority of the electoral votes. The Constitution says that the winner of the presidency has to have over 50%. Well, no one has over 50%. Jackson did win most popular votes and most electoral votes, but you have to have over 50% of the electoral college. So in this type of weird situation, it goes to the House of Representatives to choose who the president is going to be. And they're choosing between the top two candidates who had the most electoral votes. So it's going to be Jackson and John Quincy Adams. So a little bit of drama happens behind some closed doors here. The House of Representatives, who was led by Henry Clay, he's the Speaker of the House, he has this secret meeting with John Quincy Adams where they decide to get the House to vote for John Quincy Adams in exchange for John Quincy Adams choosing Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. So it's kind of like they make this deal where Adams will become president, Clay will become Secretary of State. So the House of Representatives votes for Adams, and Jackson supporters are outraged. They're like, Jackson won the most popular votes. Jackson won the most electoral votes. He should be president. But you guys are making some kind of shady deal behind closed doors. This is a corrupt bargain. Corrupt means like shady, right? Bargain is a deal. So the Jacksonian Democrats is what they're going to be called. The Jackson supporters are like, this is sketchy. This is a corrupt bargain. Henry Clay already doesn't like Andrew Jackson to begin with. He has this quote down here. I love it. He says, I cannot believe that the killing of 2,500 Englishmen at New Orleans, speaking of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, qualifies him for the various difficult and complicated duties of the presidency. Basically saying Jackson is just a military hero. He knows nothing about politics. But this is going to start kind of the beginning of a rivalry between these two guys. Okay, so John Quincy Adams is president. He, just like his father, serves only one term. He's known as being pretty uncompromising and unpopular. There's a great video. It's a short one that you can watch. It's linked right here if you want to go look at the PowerPoint to watch that, just about his presidency. But basically, no one really liked him as president. He also didn't even really like being president. And so after 4 years, he is not president anymore. Someone else gets reelected. But during those 4 years, something happens. Between 1824 and 1828, all white male citizens over 21 are allowed to vote. This is called universal white male suffrage. And a lot of these people who were not able to vote before are poor, right? They're non-landowning. And so Jackson, in the next 4 years before the next election, spends a whole bunch of his time campaigning on something called populism, which is just like, hey, common people, I'm going to support you. And so if this is 1824, when Adams became president, the amount of people that can vote. Now, let's go to 1828. You have like 1 million people, almost 3 times that, can vote now. A lot of these people are going to want to vote for Jackson because they're poor, and Jackson is saying, hey, I'm the candidate for the common person. So the election of 1828 rolls around. Jackson ends up sweeping this election. I mean, it's not even close looking at the Electoral College. And John Quincy Adams definitely loses. So Jackson becomes the 7th president. He chooses John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, who's going to become super important in the next few objectives. He chooses Calhoun to be his vice president. And the night of the inauguration, the White House is flooded with common Americans who are all going to the White House to kind of see their president take office. So now we're kind of back to a two-party system. The Democratic Republicans have split into 2 new parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. And we'll talk about why the Whig Party has that name in just a minute. But let's start with the Democrats here. The Democrats are going to be sometimes called Jacksonian Democrats. They like to follow Jackson's political philosophy, which is known as the Jacksonian Democracy. Basically, they like to limit federal power. They like to have more states' rights, and they consider themselves to be the party of the common people. The less wealthy people, less educated people, the average American. All right, the Whig Party, on the other hand, they're going to come into existence actually during Jackson's 2nd term. But they're formed by Henry Clay, who we already know doesn't like Jackson, and a guy named Daniel Webster. The Whig Party are like a super diverse group of people. They're what's called a coalition. A coalition is just a group of people who are really different from each other, but have one common belief. And the one common belief all the Whigs have is that they hate Jackson. So they're super diverse. They're kind of all over the country. They typically tend to be more wealthy people, but not always. But again, they all agree that they do not like Jackson's policies. Some of the policies that they don't like are Jackson constantly vetoing laws, or Jackson kind of doing his own thing regardless of what the Constitution or Congress or the Supreme Court says. And so they start to view Jackson like a king. Now, over in England, there was an anti-monarch party, like an anti-king party called the Whig Party. And that's where the Whigs in America get their name from. They're like, we don't like King Andrew in the same way that the Whig Party in England doesn't like the monarchy either. So you can kind of trace our political parties now, where we've been to where we are at this point in the 1830s. You had your Federalists and Anti-Federalists, not really parties, but groups of people with different ideas. The Constitution is signed right here in the 1880s, 1890s. Then they turn into our Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Then we have our one-party system, right? The era of good feelings right here where the Federalists die off. And now we're going to break apart again into our Jacksonian Democrats and our Whigs. The top here, this is all kind of like pro-federal government. The bottom here is kind of all like states' rights. So one more note before we leave. We've mentioned these guys a few times. Henry Clay, which is this guy. Daniel Webster, we mentioned him, and actually John C. Calhoun. We mentioned them in the War of 1812. Webster was a dove. He didn't want to go to war. Calhoun was a war hawk. He did want to go to war. These guys are so different from each other. They're from different regions. Clay is from the West, Webster from the North, Calhoun from the South. They're from different political parties. These guys right now are Whigs. Calhoun is a Democrat. They hold all different offices, never president, but they're in the cabinet at various times. He's a Speaker of the House, Henry Clay is. I think Webster is a Secretary of State for a while. I mean, so is Henry Clay. Calhoun's vice president for Jackson. Anyway, these 3 guys dominate pre-Civil War politics. This is called antebellum politics. And even though they're super different, they try to overcome their differences and compromise with each other. Like Henry Clay is the guy making the Missouri Compromise and some other compromises we'll talk about later on. These 3 guys try to work together to overcome division or sectionalism in the country. And it's going to be no surprise that when these three guys, or the Great Triumvirate, tri meaning three, when these three guys die in the 1850s, the Civil War is going to break out pretty quickly after